All right, let's dive into this mountain of info you've given us all about radiation therapy physics. Textbooks, scientific papers. Wow. You've really done your homework.
It's a fascinating field, really. Blending physics and medicine to treat disease, talk about interdisciplinary.
Definitely. It's like we're harnessing these invisible forces for good. So where do we even begin with all this?
Well, the sources all start with the basics atomic structure. Protons, neutrons, electrons.
The classic atom. But hey, even classics can be pretty complex.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember everything, even those tumors we're trying to treat, are made up of these tiny atoms.
Right, those building blocks of matter. I'm looking at these diagrams in the textbook here, showing the nucleus with the protons and neutrons all packed in.
Yeah, the nucleus, that's the dense core, positively charged because of the protons. Then you have the negatively charged electrons zipping around it.
Kind of like a mini solar system. The textbook mentions this nuclide notation, like a 2-ray for hydrogen. What's that all about?
Ah, that's a shorthand way to represent specific isotopes. So 8H tells us we're talking about hydrogen with one proton, and the mass number is 1, meaning no neutrons in this case.
Okay, so it's like a fingerprint for that specific atom. And things get interesting when we talk about radioactive decay. These radionuclides, as the sources call them, they're not so stable, are they?
Not at all. They're trying to reach a more stable energy state, and they do that through radioactive decay.
Right, releasing energy and particles in the process. The textbook mentions different types of decay, alpha, beta, gamma, kind of like a radioactive alphabet soup.
Each type has its own quirks. Alpha decay is when the nucleus throws out an alpha particle, basically a helium nucleus. Then there's beta decay.
And beta decay has 2 flavors, right? Positive and negative.
You got it. Positive beta decay involves positrons, the antimatter version of electrons. Negative beta decay releases good old-fashioned electrons.
Antimatter, wow. Sounds like something out of Star Trek. And then there's gamma decay, which is the type of radiation we often use in therapy.
Right. Exactly. Gamma decay involves the release of high-energy photons from the nucleus, and one of the sources uses cobalt-60 as an example to illustrate this.
Cobalt-60, yeah, I see that here too. It decays into nickel-60, but then...
The nickel nucleus is still in an excited state, so it emits gamma rays to finally reach stability.
And those gamma rays are what we can use to target those pesky tumor cells. Okay, I have to ask about this. The sources mention elementary particles, and I always thought protons, neutrons, and electrons were the smallest bits of matter, but then they bring up quarks.
Ah, yes, the quark. It turns out those protons and neutrons aren't so elementary after all. They're made up of even tinier particles called quarks, held together by the strong nuclear force.
So it's like finding out your Lego bricks are made of even smaller Legos. Okay, enough about the tiny stuff. How about the big machines? How do we actually generate the radiation used in therapy?
Well, one common method is X-ray production. It all happens in an X-ray tube. Basically, you have a heated filament that spits out electrons.
That's the cathode, right?
Yep. And these electrons are accelerated towards a positively charged anode by a high voltage.
So they're zooming across the tube at super speed.
Exactly. And when they slam into that anode, some of their energy gets converted into X-rays.
It's like an electron demolition derby. The textbook mentions that the X-ray output isn't always constant, especially with these self-rectified units.
Right. In those simpler units, the X-ray production is actually pulsed. The tube acts like a one-way valve for the electrical current, and since the voltage is alternating, X-rays are only produced when the anode is positive.
So bursts of X-rays rather than a steady stream. Interesting. The textbook also talks about contact therapy, using low-voltage X-rays for superficial lesions.
That's because those lower energy X-rays have a rapid dose fall-off. They deliver their punch right at the surface.
Ideal for those skin cancers then, without affecting deeper tissues. Makes sense. But for those deeper tumors, we need more oomph.
Exactly. That's where linear accelerators or LINACs come in. They're the workhorses of modern radiation therapy.
Yeah, those are mentioned a lot in the sources. And they use microwaves, right?
Yep, microwaves to accelerate electrons to super high energies. And those electrons can then be used directly or to generate even more powerful X-rays.
This diagram in the textbook shows all the components of a LINAC modulator, magnetron, waveguide, electron gun. It looks pretty complex.
Oh, it is a complex piece of engineering, but the basic principle is that the modulator creates precisely timed pulses of energy that power the whole process. The magnetron converts that energy into microwaves, and those microwaves accelerate the electrons produced by the electron gun. Then it's a matter of aiming those electrons.
Aim them at the patient for electron beam therapy or at a target to generate those X-rays. Clever. The textbook mentions other types of accelerators. Van de Graaff generators, microtrons, cyclotrons. Are those just different ways to do the same thing?
They all accelerate particles, but each has its own strengths and weaknesses. The Van de Graaff generator, for example, was an early type, relying on static electricity.
And microtrons.
Microtrons are kind of a hybrid. They use both electric and magnetic fields to accelerate electrons in a spiral path.
Ah, a bit of a mix and match approach. The sources seem particularly interested in cyclotrons, especially for proton beam therapy.
Cyclotrons excel at accelerating heavy charged particles like protons. And proton therapy is special because of that characteristic Bragg peak. Protons deposit most of their energy in a focused peak at the end of their path.
So we can target the tumor with high precision, minimizing damage to surrounding healthy tissues. It's like a sniper rifle of radiation.
That's a good way to put it. Cyclotrons are also used to produce neutron beams, though that's less common. They do that by smashing deuteron's heavy hydrogen nuclei into a beryllium target, and that generates the neutrons.
Okay, so we've got a whole arsenal of radiation generators, but now the big question is, how does all this radiation actually interact with the human body? The sources get pretty deep into the physics here.
This is where it gets really interesting. Understanding how radiation interacts with matter is key to understanding both the benefits and the risks of radiation therapy.
Right, because we want to maximize the damage to those cancer cells while minimizing harm to the healthy tissues around them. So the sources start by talking about photon interactions. And I see those terms again: photoelectric effect, Compton scattering.
Yep. Those are the main ways photons interact with matter. In the photoelectric effect, a photon gets completely absorbed by an atom, knocking out an electron. The probability of this happening depends on the photon's energy and the type of atom it encounters.
Ah, so that's why lead is such a good shield for X-rays. Lead has a high atomic number, so those X-ray photons are more likely to get absorbed.
You got it. Then there's Compton scattering. In this case, the photon interacts with an electron, loses some energy, and changes direction. It's kind of like a photon pinball game.
Okay, bouncing around and causing trouble. The sources also describe this crazy thing called pair production.
Pair production is wild. It happens with very high energy photons. The photon interacts with the electric field of an atom's nucleus, and its energy is converted into an electron and a positron, the antimatter version of an electron.
Antimatter again. Okay, that's blowing my mind a little. So the way a photon interacts depends on its energy and what it runs into. What about electrons? They're used in therapy too, right? How do they interact?
Well, electrons are charged particles, so they interact differently. They mainly interact with other electrons in matter, causing ionization and excitation. They can knock electrons off atoms or bump them up to higher energy levels, making the atoms unstable.
Got it. So electrons are like tiny bullets, directly interacting with the atomic structure. What about neutrons? I remember those from the cyclotron discussion.
Neutrons are a bit different because they have no charge. They don't interact directly with the electrons. Instead, they primarily interact with the nuclei of atoms, causing them to recoil.
So it's like a neutron bowling ball, knocking those nuclei around.
Pretty much. And this type of interaction is particularly effective in hydrogen-rich materials like water, because the mass of a neutron is similar to that of a proton, the nucleus of a hydrogen atom.
Interesting. So for neutron shielding, you'd want something with a lot of hydrogen, not necessarily something dense like lead,
Right.
which is what we use for X-rays.
Exactly. The best shielding material depends on the type of radiation you're trying to block. Different radiation, different defenses. But how do we actually measure how much radiation we're delivering?
Yeah, that's a good question. The sources talk about this whole world of radiation dosimetry. It sounds complicated.
It can be, but it's incredibly important. We need to know exactly how much radiation is being delivered to the tumor and to the surrounding tissues. And the key tool for measuring radiation dose is the ionization chamber.
The textbook describes it as this gas-filled chamber with 2 electrodes. How does that work?
Well, when radiation enters the chamber, it ionizes the gas, creating these charged particles called ions. We apply a voltage across the electrodes, which creates an electric field. That field pulls those ions towards the electrodes, creating a tiny current.
And by measuring that tiny current, we can figure out how much radiation has passed through the chamber. It's like counting those electron crashes in our X-ray tube analogy. More crashes, more radiation.
Exactly. And there's this concept of saturation that's important here. We need to make sure we're applying enough voltage to collect all the ions created by the radiation. Otherwise, some of them might recombine before they reach the electrodes, and we'll get an inaccurate reading.
So we need to make sure we're catching all those ions like a radiation butterfly net. The sources mention these special electrometers used to measure these tiny currents.
Electrometers are incredibly sensitive instruments. They can detect those tiny currents with incredible accuracy.
Wow, talk about precision. The sources also talk about different types of ionization chambers, thimble chambers, thin window chambers. Are those just different shapes?
It's all about picking the right tool for the job. Thimble chambers are small and cylindrical, and they're great for calibrating radiation beams. Thin window chambers, on the other hand, are designed for measuring surface doses or doses in areas where the dose changes rapidly with depth.
So it's like choosing the right measuring cup for a recipe. You need the right tool to get the right measurement. The sources also point out that other factors can affect those ionization chamber readings.
Absolutely. Things like ion recombination, which we mentioned earlier, and polarity effects can influence the accuracy of the measurements. We have to be careful to account for those factors.
And that's where calibration comes in, right? The textbook mentions calibrating those chambers regularly to make sure they're giving us accurate readings.
Calibration is crucial. It's like making sure you're measuring cups and spoons are actually measuring what they're supposed to. Otherwise, your baking could go terribly wrong.
I wouldn't want to eat a cake made with wonky measurements. Now, aside from ionization chambers, are there other ways to measure radiation dose? The sources mention a few alternatives.
There are. Thermoluminescent dosimeters, or TLDs, are these tiny crystals that store energy from radiation exposure. When you heat them up, they release that energy as light, and we can measure that light output to determine the dose.
So it's like a radiation-powered glow stick.
Kind of. And then there are diodes, little semiconductor devices that produce a current when exposed to radiation. They're small and easy to use, but their response can be energy dependent.
So we have a whole toolbox of options, but knowing their strengths and weaknesses is key. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, how radiation is generated, how it interacts with matter, and how we measure it. But now let's get to the heart of it all.
Yeah.
How do we actually use radiation to treat cancer?
That's where the art and science of radiation therapy come together. It's about taking all this knowledge and translating it into effective and safe treatments. And our sources describe two main approaches: external beam radiation therapy and brachytherapy.
So external beam is when the radiation source is outside the body, and brachytherapy is when the source is placed closer to the tumor.
Exactly. And each approach has its own set of techniques and challenges.
And those are what we'll be exploring next. Buckle up. Okay, so last time we were talking about external beam radiation and brachytherapy. What are some of the techniques and challenges involved with those?
Well, with external beam therapy, one of the biggest challenges is shaping and controlling those powerful radiation beams to precisely target the tumor while minimizing the dose to healthy tissues. It's all about precision.
Right, and I remember those sources mentioning some pretty technical concepts like beam quality and depth dose distribution. It seems like those are key for achieving that precision.
Exactly. Beam quality, as the textbook puts it, describes how the radiation beam behaves as it travels through the body. And that depth dose distribution tells us how the dose changes with depth.
Okay, so it's not just about how much radiation is coming out of the machine. It's about how that radiation is distributed as it penetrates the body.
You got it. And those parameters we talked about earlier, like percentage depth dose, PDD, they give us a map of that dose distribution. It's all about understanding where the radiation is going and how much is deposited at different depths.
So if you have a deep-seated tumor, you'd need a higher energy beam to make sure enough radiation reaches that depth without overdosing the tissues closer to the surface.
Exactly. And that's where those filters come in. They help us shape the beam's energy spectrum, kind of like adjusting the colors in a photograph. By filtering out those lower energy X-rays, we can improve penetration and reduce the dose to superficial tissues.
So it's all about fine-tuning that beam for maximum impact. The sources also talked about wedges, compensators, and blocks. Those sound like tools for sculpting that radiation beam.
Think of them as radiation stencils. They help us shape the beam to match the tumor's contours and protect the surrounding tissues.
So wedges are used to tilt the beam if the tumor is at an angle. And compensators adjust for differences in tissue density. Like if you have a tumor near a bone, the bone would absorb radiation differently, so you'd need to compensate for that.
Exactly. And blocks, well, they do exactly what their name suggests. They block the radiation from hitting certain areas, like critical organs.
Right.
It's all about getting the right dose to the right place.
It seems like it's a delicate balancing act. Those multi-leaf collimators, MLCs, those sound pretty high-tech.
MLCs are game changers. They allow us to create a dynamic radiation stencil that can actually change shape during treatment. Imagine a stencil with hundreds of tiny leaves that can move in and out of the beam path, all controlled by a computer. We can shape the beam to match the tumor, even if it's irregular or changing shape.
It's like having a radiation beam that can morph and adapt in real time. That's amazing.
That's what allows us to do things like intensity modulated radiation therapy, or IMRT. We'll talk about that more later. It's all about shaping the radiation dose with incredible precision. But let's shift gears now and talk about brachytherapy. It's a whole different approach to radiation therapy.
Brachytherapy, right. Instead of zapping the tumor from outside the body, we're bringing the radiation source much closer. It's like we're embedding a tiny radiation warrior right next to the tumor.
That's a great analogy. And the key principle here is that radiation dose decreases rapidly with distance. So by placing the source close to the tumor, we can deliver a high dose to that localized area while minimizing the dose to the surrounding healthy tissues.
It's like a surgical strike of radiation. But I can also see how brachytherapy would require very careful planning and execution.
Oh, absolutely. We have to consider the type of radioactive source we're using, the placement of that source, and the duration of the treatment. It's a very personalized approach.
The sources mention radium, cesium-137, iridium-192, and iodine-125 as some of the key players in brachytherapy. What's the difference between these isotopes?
They differ in their radioactive properties, their half-lives, and the energy of the radiation they emit. And those differences make them suitable for different types of treatments.
Right, like you wouldn't use the same tool for every job. Sometimes you need a hammer, sometimes a screwdriver. It's about picking the right isotope for the right situation.
Exactly. And there are different ways to deliver the source, too. There are permanent implants, where tiny radioactive seeds are left in the tumor permanently, and temporary implants, where the source is removed after a certain amount of time.
Permanent versus temporary, huh? And then the sources also mention low dose rate, LDR, and high dose rate, HDR brachytherapy. What's the difference there?
LDR brachytherapy delivers a low dose of radiation over a longer period, like days or even weeks, while HDR brachytherapy delivers a high dose over a shorter period, usually minutes. Again, the choice depends on the specific tumor and the clinical situation.
So, slow and steady versus quick and intense. The sources also mention this thing called afterloading. It sounds a bit like a magic trick.
It's a safety measure, actually. Afterloading means we place hollow applicators or catheters into the treatment area first, and then insert the radioactive sources later, once the medical staff is at a safe distance. This minimizes radiation exposure for the team.
That's really smart, protecting the people who are delivering the treatment. Okay, so whether it's external beam therapy or brachytherapy, planning the treatment must be incredibly complex.
Absolutely. It's like a carefully choreographed dance where we're trying to deliver the radiation precisely to the tumor while minimizing the dose to healthy tissues. We use sophisticated software and imaging techniques to create a virtual 3D model of the patient's anatomy, and then we design the treatment plan on that model.
It's like having a 3D map of the battlefield, showing the enemy's position and all the surrounding territory.
Precisely. And we use that map to plan the radiation attack, making sure we hit the target with the right dose while minimizing collateral damage. And to fine-tune that plan, we use simulators.
Right, simulators, the sources mentioned those. They're basically mock-ups of the actual treatment machine.
Exactly. They allow us to verify the plan, make sure the patient will be in the correct position, and check all the technical details before we deliver the real treatment.
So it's like a dress rehearsal for the main event. The sources also emphasize the importance of accurate patient positioning during treatment.
Oh, that's critical. Even tiny movements can affect the accuracy of the radiation delivery. We use all sorts of techniques and devices to keep the patient still and in the same position throughout the treatment.
It's like playing a game of radiation darts, and we don't want to miss the target. And those advanced imaging techniques like CT and MRI, those play a big role in planning too, right?
Absolutely. They give us that detailed map of the battlefield showing the tumor, the surrounding organs, and all those critical structures.
It's like having X-ray vision, but even better, because we get a 3D picture. Okay, we've covered the basics of treatment planning and delivery, but I'm curious, how did we even get to this point? How did radiation therapy evolve? The sources take us on a little historical tour, starting with radium.
Radium was one of the first radioactive elements used in medicine, and it has a fascinating history, both good and bad. It was discovered in 1898 by Marie and Pierre Curie, and its potential for both healing and harm was quickly recognized.
Right, like those radium girls who painted watch dials and suffer from radiation poisoning. It's a reminder that we have to be very careful with radiation.
Absolutely. But in the early days, radium was also seen as a potential miracle cure for cancer. People were fascinated by its radioactive properties, and it was used to treat tumors, sometimes with good results, but sometimes with terrible side effects.
The textbook mentions that radium decays through a whole series of steps, releasing different types of radiation. Why was that a problem?
Those different types of radiation, alpha particles, beta particles, and gamma rays, they all have different properties and different biological effects. Alpha particles, for example, are heavy and positively charged, and they don't penetrate very far.
So good for targeting superficial tumors, but not for deep-seated ones.
Exactly. Beta particles are lighter and negatively charged, so they penetrate a bit deeper. But gamma rays, those are the real powerhouses, penetrating deep into tissues.
So for treating those deep tumors, you'd want the gamma rays from radium. But the textbook mentions that radium has a really long half-life.
Yeah, about 1,600 years. That means it takes a very long time for its radioactivity to decay, which made it difficult to control the dose and posed a long-term radiation hazard.
So radium was a pioneer, but its limitations became clear over time. The sources then talk about cesium-137, which seems to have been a big deal after World War II.
Cesium-137 is a fission product, which means it's produced in nuclear reactors. It became readily available after the war, and it emits gamma rays that are suitable for treating many types of cancer. Plus, its half-life, about 30 years, is more manageable than radium's.
Shorter half-life, less long-term risk. Makes sense. But the sources say that even cesium-137 has largely been replaced in modern brachytherapy.
Right. We're always looking for better tools. Iridium-192 is much more common these days.
Okay, so cesium-137 was important, but it's not a major player anymore. Now, the sources shift their focus to cobalt-60. That sounds familiar. Wouldn't we talk about that in the context of external beam therapy?
Yes. Cobalt-60 was actually used for both external beam and brachytherapy. It emits high-energy gamma rays that are effective in treating those deep-seated tumors. In the old days, they used these massive machines called cobalt units to deliver external beam therapy.
I've seen pictures. Those things look like something out of a sci-fi movie.
They were impressive machines, but they were eventually replaced by linear accelerators, or LINACs, which are much more versatile and precise.
So cobalt-60 has gone the way of the dinosaur in external beam therapy, but it still has some uses in brachytherapy.
Exactly. It's still used for some brachytherapy applications where its high activity and small source size are beneficial. But let's talk about the current superstar of brachytherapy, iridium-192.
Okay, iridium-192, hit me with it. What makes it so special?
Iridium-192 is a versatile isotope that's well-suited for many brachytherapy applications. It emits gamma rays, but they have a lower energy than cobalt-60, so it's a good choice for treating tumors closer to the surface or near sensitive organs where we want to minimize collateral damage.
So it's a bit more delicate than cobalt-60, like using a scalpel instead of a hammer.
Exactly, and it has a relatively short half-life, about 74 days, which makes it safer from a radiation standpoint. It decays quickly, so there's less long-term risk, and that short half-life makes it very suitable for HDR brachytherapy.
HDR brachytherapy, right, that quick and intense radiation blast. Iridium-192 seems like a good fit for that.
It is. We can deliver a high dose over a short period, minimizing exposure time for both the patient and the medical team. And then there's iodine-125, another important isotope in brachytherapy. It's often used for those permanent implants, especially for prostate cancer.
Iodine-125, okay. What's its claim to fame?
It emits low-energy gamma rays, which makes it great for treating small tumors while sparing the surrounding tissues. And it has a half-life of about 60 days, so it provides continuous low dose of radiation for several months.
It's like implanting a tiny radiation generator that slowly but surely takes care of those cancer cells. Wow, we've gone from radium to cesium-137 to cobalt-60 to iridium-192 and iodine-125. It's amazing to see how the tools of radiation therapy have evolved over time.
It's a testament to the ingenuity and dedication of researchers and clinicians who are constantly searching for better ways to harness this powerful force for good. But we can't forget about the importance of safety.
Absolutely. We're dealing with radiation, and that requires a lot of care. The sources talk about all sorts of safety measures, shielding, leak testing, personnel monitoring, to minimize the risk of exposure.
Those safety measures are paramount. We want to make sure that radiation therapy is not only effective, but also safe for everyone involved. It's a complex and challenging field, but it's also incredibly rewarding.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The nuts and bolts of radiation therapy, the evolution of radioactive isotopes, the crucial importance of safety. It's clear that radiation therapy is a powerful tool in our fight against cancer. But what about the future? What's next for this field? The sources hint at some truly amazing advancements that are on the horizon.
And those advancements are what we'll dive into next. Get ready for a glimpse into the future of radiation therapy, where technology is blurring the lines between science fiction and reality.
Okay, so last time you were telling us about these mind-blowing advancements in radiation therapy. I'm ready to hear more about this sci-fi future of cancer treatment.
It's really incredible how technology is transforming this field. We were just discussing how important precision is in radiation therapy, and some of these advancements take that precision to a whole new level.
The sources mentioned image-guided radiation therapy, IGRT, and adaptive radiation therapy, RT. They sound pretty high-tech.
They are. IGRT is all about using imaging, like X-rays or CT scans, during the actual treatment to track the tumor's position.
So we can see where the tumor is in real time and make sure we're hitting the target.
Exactly. It allows us to adjust the patient's position or even the radiation beam itself to maintain pinpoint accuracy throughout the treatment.
Wow, that seems especially important for tumors that move around a lot, like those in the lungs or liver.
You're absolutely right. Those organs are constantly in motion because of breathing and other bodily functions. IGRT allows us to compensate for that motion and minimize the dose to healthy tissues.
That's like having a GPS system for radiation therapy, guiding that beam right to the target, even if it's moving.
That's a great way to put it. And IGRT isn't just about motion management. It can also help us account for changes in the tumor's size and shape during the course of treatment, which is where ART comes in.
ART adaptive radiation therapy. So we're not just planning the treatment once at the beginning, we're actually adapting it as we go along.
Precisely. With RT, we can modify the radiation plan in the middle of the treatment course based on how the tumor is responding and any changes in the surrounding anatomy.
That's incredible. It's like having a radiation therapy team that's constantly monitoring the patient and making adjustments to the plan as needed. Talk about personalized medicine.
That's exactly what it is, personalized radiation therapy. We're taking into account each patient's individual situation and tailoring the treatment to their specific needs.
Wow, that's amazing. So we've got IGRT, we've got ART, and then the sources also mentioned motion management techniques, like respiratory gating and tumor tracking. Those sound pretty cool, too.
These techniques are specifically designed to deal with the challenge of tumor motion. Respiratory gating, for example, involves coordinating the radiation beam with the patient's breathing cycle. We only deliver the radiation when the tumor is in a predictable position, like during a breath hold.
So we're syncing the radiation with the patient's breath.
Exactly. And tumor tracking takes it a step further. It uses real-time imaging to continuously track the tumor's position and adjust the radiation beam on the fly. It's like having a radiation beam that's playing a game of tag with the tumor.
Okay, that's officially mind-blowing. It sounds like these motion management techniques are making a big difference, especially for tumors that were once considered really difficult to treat with radiation.
Absolutely. They're opening up new possibilities for tumors in the lungs, liver, and other organs that are constantly moving. But one of the most exciting advancements in radiation therapy, in my opinion, is proton beam therapy.
Proton beam therapy, yeah. We talked about that earlier, and I remember you mentioned this thing called the Bragg peak.
Right. The Bragg peak is what makes proton therapy so unique and so powerful. Protons deposit most of their energy in a very narrow peak at the end of their range.
So it's like a radiation bullet that goes straight to the target and then releases all its energy right there, minimizing damage to the surrounding tissues.
That's a great analogy, and that precision is a game changer, especially when we're treating tumors near critical organs like the brain, spinal cord, or heart.
I can see how that would be a huge advantage. The sources also mentioned that proton therapy is particularly beneficial for treating pediatric cancers.
That's because children are more vulnerable to the long-term effects of radiation. Their bodies are still developing, so minimizing the dose to healthy tissues is critical. Proton therapy allows us to do that much more effectively.
So it's about giving those young patients the best chance at a healthy future.
Exactly. And proton therapy technology is constantly evolving too. We have new techniques like range modulation, where we adjust the energy of the proton beam to spread out that Bragg peak and cover the entire tumor volume, and pencil beam scanning, where we use magnets to sweep a very narrow beam across the tumor, painting the radiation dose with incredible precision.
It's amazing how we're able to manipulate these subatomic particles with such finesse. It sounds like proton beam therapy is really at the cutting edge.
It is, but there are other promising advancements as well, like heavy ion therapy, which uses even heavier particles like carbon ions to deliver radiation, and targeted radionuclide therapy, where we attach radioactive isotopes to molecules that specifically seek out cancer cells.
So we're not just hitting the tumor with radiation, we're actually sending those radioactive isotopes directly to the cancer cells.
Exactly. And those miniature Linux you mentioned earlier, those are being developed for intraoperative radiation therapy, or IoT.
IRT, so we're talking about using radiation during surgery.
That's right. The idea is to deliver a dose of radiation directly to the tumor bed after the tumor has been